A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome once again to video games that are totally awesome. Now, I get the feeling that some people are going to want me to talk a bit about something more thrill park-esque. So I get the feeling that the more theme park aesthetic of gaming probably needs a bit more attention. I'll admit, I haven't really talked much about some franchises out there, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, unless we're talking about adventures. That unfortunately didn't do all too well. But I guess looking back, there hasn't been all that much mention about other theme park related games. I could have talked about Sim Park, Sim Theme Park, part of the Sim series, like Sim City, if you will. There was a theme park version in there. But I guess a few others would include Roller Coaster Tycoon, Planet Coaster, and of course, Thrillville. So I get the feeling that we're going to want to cover those again. Let's go ahead and get started no further than good old Thrillville. First made possible by the likes of Frontier. Yeah, a while before they came up with Planet Coaster in 2016, and then came along with a sequel a few years later. But until that happened, Thrillville was essentially what could be known as their precursor to the likes of Planet Coaster and other such theme park games that they made over the years, where it simply followed along a scientist whom invites the player to come along and create their own theme park, to be the supposed dream manager of the theme park itself. The manager, of course, happens to be, would you know, a child involved. But it's basically a collection of different characters that are pre-made, which there's little to no customization feature. Even though some games have had customizable characters in-game, many which would include interchangeable hairstyles, colors, iris colors, body, shape, height, weight, etc. All these different features of physicality that made a character unique within a game, it was actually quite common, even by the year 2006. But the thing is that Thrillville had a bunch of pre-made characters. And some of these characters, unfortunately, hadn't quite gone through my mind, although one of which in particular that I've been known to play over the years was Harry. Yeah, I was kind of obsessed with Home Alone back then, so the name spoke out to me pretty well. This was, of course, before Harry Potter, but we don't need to get into that sort of stuff, at least for a little while. Anyways, though, Thrillville starts us off with a cutscene involving a guy known as Dr. Mortimer, and his envision of allowing for the perfect theme park in cohesion with the likes of many competitors out there in the field. He essentially enlists us, the player, to go on the trip alongside him. And with his guidance in the form of 5 different columns of light, which indicate various factors that play a critical role in the park's success. There's maintenance work, there's park work, there's guest work, and then of course you have the likes of gaming and even happiness. The thing is that park goers from all over the country or even the world are going to want to come over to Thrillville and visit the many sections of the park that have to do with various themes. These themes can range from anything. You have cars demolishing each other, dinosaurs, mummies, pirates, and even hell itself. A good variety of different biomes and themes in particular to choose from, which allows for not only the player or the manager in particular of the theme park to get a good look at what to expect from the many people that come to the park, wanting to experience the rides, games, foods, drinks, and even have some occasional assistance with the likes of janitors, mechanics, and cheerleaders. But Thrillville and the 5 different worlds in particular that you explore, with each and every world, there's a good set of guidelines that come around. They're essentially end goals that you have to meet. And while the missions do help to make it clear exactly what they want you to accomplish in life when it comes to the park's success, like you could have a certain game or stall put up, for instance, as well as restrooms. But for the most part, It's a lot of the basic sort of stuff that would accompany any other sort of theme park game, like Roller Coaster Tycoon or Planet Coaster. A lot of the basic sort of stuff that's implemented as the guests want certain specific things. They want certain rides, they want certain games, they want certain food or drink to be available, and they also occasionally want to have the assistance of entertainment by the cheerleaders or mascots of the parks, as well as the occasional maintenance work by mechanics and cleanup by the janitors. So at the end of the day, it might seem like a somewhat tacky and same old stuff kind of conundrum, but at the end of the day, I consider Thrillville to be quite the high contender, mostly by means of nostalgia. And let's not forget that 10 years later, Frontier would try their hand at it again and having a little more success with their Planet Coaster series. And it's been around since 2016, so after nearly another decade of time had passed, it's still going on rather strong and even had a sequel on the PlayStation Store last year. So, think about it. Planet Coaster has held up way more so than Thrillville has, mostly because of how much bigger it had managed to get, and the production value does also tend to speak for itself. But when you think about it, Thrillville was the true piece, as well as the sequel, Off the Rails by Frontier. They truly started it all when it came to Frontier's own contention with the likes of theme park related entertainment. But I guess we might as well get down to the real business of people whom are big fans of Thrillville. 5 different things in particular, much like the columns of light that help you guide your way through the park and how to make it a success. 5 things in particular that I'm going to point out that are big highlights of the game as well as the sequel. Number 1, we got to talk about the rides themselves. The rides in particular can range from roller coasters to various typical rides out there. There's the Egg Beater, the Ferris wheel, the carousel, and of course there's other pieces. Trampolines, for instance, which also doubles as its own game. So, with some instances of attractions doubling into their own games, it's a unique way to double down on the entertainment value as well as what you can expect to get in order to maintain your end goal. Number 2 are in fact the games. As I've said, the trampolines are just one of the many games you can expect to play on here. For instance, there's Event Horizon, which is a 2D shooter in which the spaceship moves sideways and shoots various ammo at different enemies, and sometimes asteroids. Some people might compare this game, as well as some others, to various classic titles, and to tell you the truth, looking back, some of these games do in fact have very similar relation, if not straight up ripping off classic titles. Event Horizon kind of gives a very similar feel to other 2D space shooters that were released way back in the day, some of which would include Light Force or even R-Type, just as a few examples. Another game of Thrillville that's very well memorable is known as Luftwaffe. This one is more of a 2D shooter in which that you move up and down rather than heading straight to the right, like in Event Horizon. Luftwaffe, of course, has a similar feel to various Capcom-based World War II games like the 1942 series. These series of games were in fact 2D shooters where fighter planes engage in battle in aerial combat in the midst of World War II. And Luftwaffe, of course, has a similar sort of thing to it, but Luftwaffe itself is the title that is in fact inspired by the somewhat well-known German aerial combats that were real horrifying events that took place throughout most of Europe during World War II. Just the same as how 1942 and all of its sequels and branch-offs and spin-offs and etc. had also taken the basis to. Another game, of course, is known as Sumo Saucers. Yeah, basically you're controlling saucers, like UFOs in a way, trying to shove the other players off the ring. It's a pretty unique challenge. Considering the fact that some of these games can allow for up to 4 players at a time, I probably could never imagine having 3 of my own friends along and we'd be shoving each other off the ring and racking up points for every time that we knock an opponent off the ring. There's also the chance that we could either get frozen or one of us turns into a buzzsaw, or there's also the occasional batons that appear in the ring out of nowhere. It's one of those challenges that, much like with Marble It Up Ultra that I talked about recently, you end up building up momentum the longer that you fly in one direction. So you really got to be careful because you might slip and fall off the ring yourself at times, which I find to be a little funny at times. These are saucers, not marbles though. So a similar thing can be noted here, just as how I've talked about with Marble It Up Ultra. But I feel like that's a good amount of games that I've already mentioned here. I'll probably talk a bit more about the games themselves in the sequel, Thrillville Off the Rails. The third thing, of course, is the interaction with the guests. There's a good variety of different guests to interact with, and a good variety of different voice acting that goes together, but I can't say that they're at their best. It's still at least worthy to note that they have done their best in terms of putting an effort towards maintaining emotional stature. And of course, when certain things are mentioned or talked about, the guests' reactions do feel a bit legitimate. Probably not at their best like they could have been, but for a game like this that wasn't as big as Frontier's other masterpieces at the time, it's safe to say that Thrillville at least had some good voice acting. Not just by Dr. Mortimer, who came out to be quite the zany scientist character, kind of like Emmett Brown from Back to the Future, or even when Gene Wilder portrayed young Frankenstein, as a few examples in that field. I will say the voice acting, based on the guests as well as your in-game characters, they also seem to go well with each other. And like I've said, all the interactions can go on for hours. I mean, there's just lots of ways that you can interact with everybody. Lots of trivia to note, lots of things to gather, and lots of knowledge that you could potentially build yourself. Various trivia and notes and history lessons, they really do help to build up friendships, and believe it or not, you can sometimes even engage in romantic activities. That's pretty deep, man. Of course, that's just 3 things that I've contended here. Number 4, we probably ought to talk a bit about the challenges relating to the mechanics, janitors, and cheerleaders. Of course, they themselves are their own games in particular. So much like the trampoline is its own attraction and its own game, along with some other games and attractions that I've noted as well, the likes of cheerleading, maintenance work, and janitorial work also doubles as their own challenges. So you might think that it's boring, by the way, but it apparently is not. In fact, I somehow can't quite get enough of the unique puzzle solving of the grid system when it comes to replacing fuse boxes as the mechanic, or how about as the janitor, where you're cleaning up piles of vomit or picking up various trash with a vacuum cleaner. It's a unique challenge in order to rack up points. Even though it goes on for some time, it hardly gets old. The sound effects are, in fact, pretty satisfying as well. And as for the cheerleader, it's probably the equivalent of what you might say could be in relevance to other games that require certain button mashing. I wouldn't say it's as good as the other two, but in the end, the button mashing portion does allow for the cheerleaders to perform in various moves, and this does, believe it or not, allow me to come to the 4th thing. Then going on to the 5th thing. Because after all, I've talked about 4 different things, unique strengths about the game. And while the 4th thing had itself janitorial, mechanic, and cheerleader work doubling as their own mini-games, the 5th and final thing, of course, is the soundtrack. That's probably one of the bigger strengths about it. Because have you ever gotten the idea of why there are certain songs in Kaiju Force Neo's Ecstatic Mixover? Yeah, 384 tracks that album has. It's a lot of money I'm probably going to have to dish out for royalties. But in any case, it's definitely worth noting. The reason why there are some songs out there that seem familiar is because this is exactly where they come from. Think about it. Fountains of Wayne's song Maureen, for instance, came out in 2005, a year before this game. That is on the album. And then, of course, there's also other well-known highlights that have come out over the years, a good amount of which have also made it to the Ecstatic Mixover. Unique pieces of nostalgia that have made it to the Ecstatic Mixover. And while I will say that Off the Rails technically has more memorable titles that have also made their way to Ecstatic Times more so than with the first game, Thrillville itself still did have a good amount of its own copyrighted soundtrack, although it also had some of its own original music just as well, some of which were made by actual artists. So, think about it. It's a lot like how we had Bowling for Soup make their own song about Super Mario Brothers. It's a lot like how some artists had also made entire songs dedicated to various franchises over the years. Remember that song about Peter Pan? Well, I won't forget that. Along with many other things out there that have to do with licensed franchises and copyrighted material, we know that's not necessarily illegal or committing copyright infringement to even reference to anything, let alone have entire songs based off of it. But I guess for the matter of having the content itself actually featured, like in your music video, that's a different story. But in terms of audio related things, even the sound effects seem to be not exactly trademarked or copyrighted to the copyright holder, which does mean that there's a good variety of us, even myself, I've actually used certain sound effects that were well known because they came from specific sources. So there you go. That's basically 5 big strengths that made Thrillville such a popular piece. A cult classic in a way, as it is nearing that age. But what are some weaknesses? Probably one thing about it though is the animation. It's kind of off for something like this. I mean, this is PS2. We can't really put a whole lot of blame on this one, nor could we do the same thing with other PS2 games. Because PS2, there's a reason why it's considered to be the greatest console ever made in gaming history. Even more so than NES and Genesis combined. And the thing is, while PS1 was the one that started it all, it was PS2 that ultimately put Sony's name on the map. And probably left it there all this time. So, I guess this pretty much just marks my end for this whole entire review. And I'll probably follow up with Thrillville Off the Rails, because there's a lot more that I have yet to talk about. But between all the different worlds that you get to work with, all the different parks you get to play around with, all the cutscenes featuring Mortimer, and all the different copyrighted songs that were featured in this game, as well as its sequel, all the different minigames that have become well known over the years, and many other things, the Thrillville duology certainly is one that I was more than wanting to do reviews on. Especially knowing the fact that I've actually revisited both of these games not too long ago. And so, with that in mind, my first Thrillville rating on this one will probably stick to a good 8.3 out of 10.1. And I will admit, there's probably going to be a lot more for me to talk about when it comes to Off the Rails, which I'll be uploading soon. So, you want to stay tuned for that. And if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.